What you are about to hear is the story of Mikhail and Yelena, two lovers who defied a king and braved the frozen wilderness, proving that nothing can stand in the way of true love. The following morning, the wind had calmed slightly, and the pale light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a faint glow over the frozen landscape. Mikhail awoke, his body aching from the cold, but his mind sharper than it had been in days. The memory of the lone traveler he had seen across the frozen lake fueled his determination, giving him the strength he needed to put his plan into action. The guards were distracted, groggy from the long night and the bitter cold, as they prepared to continue the journey. Mikhail watched them carefully, noting the smallest details, the way one of the guards' hands shook as he fumbled with the reins of the horses, the tired look in their eyes, and the slight limp of the captain who had twisted his ankle a few days earlier. They were vulnerable, just as he was, and that gave Mikhail the opening he needed. His wrists were bound, but the ropes had loosened slightly from the constant rubbing and shifting during the long days of travel. Mikhail glanced around cautiously, his heart racing. The guards were busy loading the cart, their backs to him. Taking a deep breath, Mikhail began working the ropes against the sharp edge of the cart's wooden frame, inching them back and forth as quietly as possible. His hands burned with effort, but his mind was focused on one thing: escape. Minutes felt like hours as Mikhail's heartbeat drummed in his ears. Finally, with a sharp snap, the rope gave way. He was free, but he had to act quickly. Without wasting a second, Mikhail slipped from the cart and moved toward the dense forest that bordered the frozen lake. His breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, the cold biting at his lungs as he sprinted toward the cover of the trees. Each step felt like a lifetime, every sound magnified in the stillness of the morning. The guards didn't notice his absence at first. The noise of the cart and horses masked the soft crunch of snow beneath Mikhail's boots as he darted through the trees. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through his veins. He knew they would realize he was gone soon, and when they did, they would come after him with a fury. But for now, he had the advantage. As he ran, his thoughts flashed back to Yelena, the image of her face giving him the strength to push through the biting cold and the exhaustion that clung to his body. He couldn't fail. He couldn't let her down. His love for her was stronger than the fear that gnawed at his bones, stronger than the cold that tried to pull him back. With every step, Mikhail reminded himself of his promise to survive, to return to her, no matter the cost. Behind him, the shouts of the guards echoed through the forest. They had discovered his absence. Mikhail's pulse quickened, his legs burning as he forced himself to run faster, deeper into the wilderness. The trees blurred past him, their branches heavy with snow. The air was thin and sharp, making each breath painful, but Mikhail didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. As he ran, the frozen lake appeared to his right, its surface a sheet of glistening ice that stretched endlessly into the distance. The memory of the traveler he had seen the night before gave him a flicker of hope. Somewhere out there, in the desolate wilderness, there was life. If he could just keep going, if he could outpace the guards, he might have a chance. Mikhail continued through the thick forest, weaving between the trees, his boots slipping on patches of ice hidden beneath the snow. His lungs burned from the cold, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he knew stopping wasn't an option. The sounds of the guards faded into the distance, but he couldn't be sure they had given up. He had to keep moving, had to find shelter before nightfall. Hours passed in a blur of snow and trees. Mikhail had no sense of time, only the burning desire to keep going, to stay ahead of the guards. The forest thinned as he made his way toward the foothills of a distant mountain range. The land stretched out before him, a vast, icy wilderness that seemed to have no end. The sight of it was both inspiring and terrifying. He was truly alone in the frozen world, with nothing but his determination to survive. But he wasn't without hope. Mikhail spotted a small cave at the base of a hill, partially hidden by snow-covered boulders. Exhausted, he stumbled toward it, his legs shaking beneath him. Inside, the cave was dark and cold, but it provided shelter from the bitter wind that howled outside. Mikhail collapsed against the stone wall, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to collect his thoughts. The reality of his situation settled over him. He had escaped, but his journey was far from over. The guards were likely still searching for him, and the frozen wilderness of Siberia stretched on for miles, unforgiving and vast. As the daylight faded and the cold deepened, Mikhail thought of Yelena. She was his only reason for enduring, his only source of warmth in the frozen expanse. He pictured her face, the way her eyes sparkled beneath the northern lights, the sound of her laughter that had filled him with such joy. His heart ached with the need to see her again, to hold her, to tell her that no force in the world, not even the icy grip of Siberia, could keep him from returning to her. Mikhail knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous, but the thought of Yelena gave him strength. He would face the mountains, the snow, and the cold with everything he had. And somehow, he would find his way back to her. With that thought burning in his mind, Mikhail drifted into a fitful sleep, knowing that the true test of his endurance was just beginning. The pale morning light crept into the cave, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Mikhail awoke to the biting chill of Siberia, his body stiff from the cold and his mind still foggy with exhaustion. For a brief moment, he was disoriented, unsure of where he was, until the events of the past few days came rushing back. The escape, the chase, the endless forest. He was still alive, still free, but only just. He forced himself to his feet, his legs weak from days of running and little food. The cave had provided temporary shelter from the bitter wind, but it was no refuge. His body shivered uncontrollably, his clothes soaked with sweat from the relentless effort to stay ahead of the guards. The cave had shielded him from the elements, but he knew he couldn't linger. His only hope was to keep moving, to put as much distance between himself and the guards as possible. Somewhere beyond the frozen wilderness lay the road back to Yelena, and that thought alone gave him the strength to keep going. Mikhail stepped out into the morning light, the vast Siberian wilderness stretching out before him in an endless sea of white. The forest was behind him now, replaced by the looming shadows of the mountain range ahead. The mountains, with their jagged peaks and snow-covered cliffs, seemed to rise out of the earth like ancient sentinels. They were beautiful and terrifying all at once, a reminder of the brutal reality of Siberia. But Mikhail didn't have a choice, he had to cross them. The path to the mountains was slow and treacherous. Each step was a battle against the deep snow that pulled at his feet and the biting wind that cut through his clothes like a blade. The sun hung low in the sky, offering no warmth, only a faint glow against the cold expanse of ice and rock. Mikhail's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale burning his lungs as the icy air filled his chest. But he pressed on, his mind fixed on Yelena, on the promise he had made to survive. As the hours passed, the climb became steeper, the terrain more treacherous. Mikhail's legs ached with every step, his muscles straining against the unforgiving ascent. The ground beneath him shifted with the weight of the snow, threatening to send him tumbling down the mountainside at any moment. But he kept going, one foot in front of the other, his hands grasping at rocks and frozen branches to steady himself. The cold was relentless, gnawing at his bones, but the fire in his heart, his love for Yelena, burned brighter. By midday, Mikhail reached a narrow pass between two towering cliffs. The wind howled through the pass like a beast, swirling snow into the air and blinding him. He squinted against the whiteout, his vision blurred as he struggled to navigate the narrow ledge. One misstep, and he would plunge into the abyss below. His heart pounded in his chest, fear tightening around his throat, but he forced himself to remain steady. He couldn't afford to let fear take hold now. For hours, Mikhail inched his way across the pass, the wind tearing at his clothes, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. He had lost feeling in his fingers long ago, his hands now numb and stiff as he grasped the icy rocks. The snow stung his face and the wind roared in his ears, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Yelena's face was all he could see in his mind's eye, her voice the only thing that kept him moving. She was waiting for him. She was the reason he fought so hard to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mikhail reached the other side of the pass. The wind began to calm, and the snow no longer swirled violently around him. He stood for a moment, catching his breath, his legs trembling from the effort of the climb. But there was no time to rest. The sky was beginning to darken, and he needed to find shelter before nightfall. Siberia's nights were unforgiving, colder than anything he had experienced during the day. If he was caught in the open when the sun went down, the cold would consume him, just as it had claimed so many before him. Mikhail pressed on, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of shelter. As the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains, he spotted a small opening in the rock face ahead. A cave, tucked away at the base of the mountain, just large enough to provide shelter for the night. With the last of his strength, Mikhail made his way to the cave, his body nearly collapsing from exhaustion as he stepped inside. The cave was cold and damp, but it shielded him from the wind and snow. Mikhail sank to the ground, his body trembling uncontrollably from the cold. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pulled his thin coat tight around him, trying to retain what little warmth he had left. He knew he couldn't last much longer like this. The journey had already taken its toll on him, and the mountains had only just begun. There were still miles to go, more obstacles to face, and his body was reaching its limit. But his mind remained clear, his thoughts focused on Yelena. She was the reason he hadn't given up, the reason he hadn't let the cold, the snow, or the fear take him. Mikhail closed his eyes and pictured her standing beneath the linden tree, her smile lighting up the world around her. That memory alone was enough to push back the darkness creeping into his heart. He would keep going. He had to. For Yelena. As night fell, Mikhail huddled in the cave, shivering beneath his thin coat. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, but inside, he held onto the warmth of his memories, knowing that his love for Yelena was stronger than the coldest winter. Tomorrow, he would face the mountains again. But tonight, he would survive. Mikhail awoke to the sound of the wind howling through the mountains, its cold breath seeping into the cave where he had found shelter. His body was stiff, every muscle aching from the previous day's climb. The bitter cold had not relented during the night, and as he sat up, he felt the icy grip of Siberia tighten around him once more. The fire of determination still burned in his chest, but his body was weakening. His hands trembled as he pulled his thin coat tighter, knowing it would do little against the cold. Yet, despite the pain, the hunger, and the relentless chill, Mikhail forced himself to stand. The mountains may have slowed him, but they wouldn't stop him. He had made a promise to Yelena, and he would keep it no matter the cost. The daylight outside was dim, the sun obscured by thick, swirling clouds of snow. Mikhail could barely make out the path ahead, but he had no choice but to continue. With his body aching and his mind focused solely on survival, he pressed forward into the wilderness. The mountains loomed behind him now, their jagged peaks a reminder of the treacherous climb he had conquered. But what lay ahead was no less dangerous. The forest beyond the mountains was a vast expanse of towering, snow-covered trees that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with silence, the only sound the crunch of Mikhail's boots sinking into the snow with each step. The trees, once a symbol of life and shelter, now felt like cold sentinels watching over him as he trudged through the icy wasteland. The frozen forest was a labyrinth, its twisted paths obscured by snow and frost. The trees were so densely packed that the sun barely pierced the canopy, casting the world in a dim, eerie light. Mikhail's breath formed clouds in the freezing air as he moved forward, each step slower than the last. His body was running on pure willpower, each muscle protesting with every movement. Despite the physical toll, Mikhail's thoughts remained with Yelena. He imagined her face, her voice, the way her laughter had once filled his heart with warmth. Even in the most desolate parts of Siberia, his love for her remained a bright, unwavering light that guided him through the darkness. He clung to the memory of the night they spent beneath the northern lights, the promise they made to each other that no force in the world could break their bond. He had survived the mountains for her, and he would survive the forest as well. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending maze of snow and ice. The bitter wind cut through Mikhail's clothes, his skin numb from the relentless cold. His legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and his lips were cracked and dry. But he kept moving, driven by the thought of Yelena waiting for him, her heart beating in time with his. As the sun began to set, casting the sky in shades of pale blue and pink, Mikhail's strength began to falter. The forest had become a wall of ice, closing in around him. His vision blurred as exhaustion weighed heavily on his eyelids. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him, and collapsed into the snow. For a moment, he considered staying down. The cold was so deep now that it had become almost comforting, the numbness spreading through his body like a dark wave. But then, through the haze of his fading consciousness, he heard something that broke through the silence of the frozen wilderness. It was the sound of voices. Mikhail's heart leapt, and he forced his eyes open, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he had heard. He struggled to his feet, swaying as the world spun around him. The voices were faint, distant, but unmistakable. People. Mikhail stumbled toward the sound, his legs weak, his hands numb, but his heart pounding with renewed hope. Through the thick veil of snow, he caught glimpses of movement shadows in the forest. His pulse quickened, and he pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain, the hunger, the cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mikhail emerged from the trees and into a small clearing. Before him, nestled against the base of a large hill, was a small village. Smoke rose from the chimneys of wooden cottages, and the warm glow of firelight flickered through the windows. It was the first sign of life he had seen since his journey began. He stood there for a moment, his body trembling, as the sight of the village filled him with a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He had made it. There were people here. Shelter. Warmth. But as he took a step forward, The world around him blurred, and his body gave into the exhaustion that had been threatening to overtake him for hours. The ground rushed up to meet him, and the last thing Mikhail saw before the darkness consumed him was the flicker of firelight in the distance. When Mikhail awoke, he was no longer lying in the snow. Instead, he found himself wrapped in thick furs, the warmth of a fire crackling nearby. His body ached, his head felt heavy, but for the first time in days, he was warm. He blinked against the dim light of the room, his mind slowly piecing together what had happened. He had collapsed in the snow. The village. Someone had found him. A soft voice broke through his thoughts, and Mikhail turned to see an older woman kneeling beside him, her face lined with age but kind. She was speaking to him, her voice gentle, though Mikhail could barely register the words. His mind was still foggy, his body weak from days of cold and hunger. But he understood enough to know that he was safe, at least for now. "You're lucky," she said softly, handing him a cup of warm broth. Few survive the forest alone in winter. Mikhail took the cup, his hands shaking as he sipped the warm liquid. The heat spread through him like a lifeline, and for the first time in days, he felt his strength returning. The village had saved him from certain death, but his journey wasn't over. Siberia was vast, and the path ahead was still long. Yet, despite the danger that still lay before him, Mikhail felt hope stir in his chest once more. The forest had nearly broken him, but it hadn't succeeded. He had survived. And as long as he was alive, he would keep moving forward. Yelena was still waiting for him.